What remains of wars? If there weren't any pictures for us to remember them by, there would be just statistics, grieving, and lists of names. These photographs have shocked the world. Their capacity to reveal the horror of war and to record history in progress has led many photographers to become politically aware, to side with a particular cause, or else to fight for peace. When Roger Fenton, the first war photographer, left for Crimea, it was agreed that he would not photograph the dead or wounded so as not to discourage the volunteers. The 360 toned-down photos he brought back to London brought his peers closer to the reality of war. Brady covered the American Civil War. When it started, he built a mobile lab, left his New York studio, bound for Virginia. His team had their own wagon called the What Is It by Curious Soldiers. Lincoln even gave him a pass to enable him to go anywhere. Brady and his men sometimes risked their lives covering this war, but they brought back thousands of daguerreotypes despite the long preparation times and the 1-minute exposure times. The photographs are tragic. The dead and wounded are scattered all over the battlefields. These photos had a profound impact on the general public as they were confronted with the horrors of war for the first time.
War has very close links with photography because it creates extreme situations. It makes men react very expressively, for want of a better word. So war and photography are strange bedfellows, but bedfellows nonetheless. I think that war has brought about an art of photography and of reporting that we do not see in peacetime.
In 1871, the Prussians were in Paris. The Commune rose up against the official power base in Versailles. Photographers took pictures of the crowds, and the bookshops were full of their photos of Paris in ruins.
Photography was used not just for illustrative purposes. The police seized the photographs of the communards in the streets to try to identify those who had escaped the massacre so that they could lock them up or deport them to New Caledonia.
Certain photographers, such as Henri CARTIer, thought nothing of staging events. In this picture of Versailles, the dead are all actors.
We should also bear in mind that at the time, people who saw a picture which looked real thought it was real. And yet all these photos of the Commune crimes were mock-ups. Henri CARTIer staged all these situations, and on each of the characters he added the real faces of the people whose experiences he was supposedly describing. They were all montages, although technically superb, but it was an early form of propaganda. Photography was already being used for ideological purposes. The truth only came out much later. I've seen books which were published after World War II, in other words in the 50s, which presented one or other of these montages as photos of the Commune. So it took a long time to get people to accept the truth.
Photography for military purposes only really took off with World War I and the strategic use of aerial photography. At first, the authorities tried to reduce the role of photographers. Military censors began by refusing them access to their front. It wasn't until 1916 that they were able to work freely. In the meantime, the soldiers themselves took photos in the trenches. Inaugurated by Nadar in the early days of photography, aerial photos enabled the Army to know of and monitor enemy positions and thus target them more precisely. After the Great War, Europe saw the rise of fascism. In July 1936, General Franco's uprising marked the start of civil war in Spain. It thrilled press photographers who rallied to the Republican cause. One of them was André Friedman, a young Hungarian who went from Paris to Madrid. He later became known under the name of Robert Capa. This legendary figure acquired a reputation as a great drinker and womanizer, always present in high society with a model on each arm.
Robert Capa was an extraordinary man. And in fact, when I'm asked sometimes what made Robert Capa such a great photographer, I say, well, he was a great photographer because he was such a great human being. He brought with the combination of his personality, his political involvement at that moment in history in the 30s, the advent of the small camera, all of that came together to give his work a kind of intensity that really no photographer had ever achieved.
Crouching in a trench, Capa photographed a volunteer at the precise moment he shot. He sent the film to Paris and 2 months later finds out that the photo had been around the world.
We now know, just within the last year or two, the identity of the man in the photograph. It's a man named Federico Borel Garcia, who was killed in a battle that was taking place just north of Cordoba in September 1936. And thus, the controversy about the photograph has been resolved definitively in favor of Capa. Today, so often, photographers who specialize in covering wars go wherever an editor may send them. But Robert Capa once said that he was unwilling to cover any war unless he felt very strongly about one side or the other. He was unwilling to risk his life unless, as he put it, he loved someone or hated someone involved. And certainly most of the wars he covered were part of the great struggle against fascism during the 30s and the 40s, in which he had a very personal stake.
Capa photographed the war in Spain with his friend David Seymour, known as Chim. In 1947, the two photographers founded the Magnum Agency with Henri CARTIer-BRESSON and George Roger. Chim would take out his camera like a doctor takes out his stethoscope, basing his diagnosis on the state of the heart. His was vulnerable, Cartier-Bresson once wrote. Chim's photos, like those of Capa, were used to illustrate magazines like Life during the whole of the war, presenting the readers with a brutally realistic vision of war. In 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. World War II had begun. Over 110 million men and women were called up. 55 million died. Photographers were at work on every front.
Photography brought the war into everyone's lives. During World War II, the German people could follow very closely what the German army was up to. Every German pored over these luxury, finely made magazines with superb photos. I lived in the occupied zone, and the German war magazines were very effective in making the people at home feel a part of the war effort.
In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa sent the German troops to the vast plains of Russia. On the Eastern Front, although photographers were present, the government suppressed all negative images. Aware of how potent it could be, they preferred to use it to glorify the army. Baltermans, who was a press photographer in the Red Army, was given the title of soldier photographer, but he could not distribute his extremely realistic photos until after the war. Other photographers joined the official TASS agency, including Evgeny Kaldei, who was 20 at the time and whose work was appreciated by Stalin. During the war, he was more attached to men than their heroic acts.
Случилась война.
Everyone took part in the war in his own way. Some became soldiers, others fought in planes or tanks. As for me, I was a photographer. I developed a passion for photography at the age of 13 from leafing through magazines and newspapers. What fascinated me was that photography managed to make time stand still. That's how it all began.
Фотограф снял. Теперь я могу через какое-то время посмотреть, как все это было.
The Nazis killed his father and 3 sisters by throwing them down a mine shaft. Calais spent the whole war with the camera in his hand and a cause to defend.
Шум войны вот сейчас.
When I see this photo, I can still hear the people's worried murmurs and their shock at the outbreak of war.
Он говорил о том, что началась война, бомбили наши города и прочее.
On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and the United States joined the Second World War. To ensure public support, the American authorities enlisted the help of famous filmmakers, writers, and photographers. Up until 1943, military censorship was strict. They were afraid that pictures could undermine American morale. In actual fact, they galvanized it. In the Pacific, the most famous American photographer was Eugene Smith, 13 combats and 23 bombing missions. Like him, photographers of all nationalities covered the military operations. The free world had only photography to see the war and hope for peace. The Marines landed at Iwo Jima. This famous photo spurred the USA on to victory. 6:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944 was also D-Day for Robert Capa, who landed at Omaha Beach in Normandy with the GIs of the 116th Infantry. For the Germans, it marked the beginning of the end, to paraphrase Churchill. In accordance with his motto, if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough, Robert Capa joined the legendary Big Red One Division on the first wave of assault. A large part of his work was ruined by the lab in London. Only a few blurred yet poignant photos remain. To hide from enemy machine gun fire, the soldiers hid behind anti-landing obstacles the Germans had set up on the beaches.
He was a very prudent man, respected by military officers for his judgment, not taking unnecessary risks, though taking risks that by ordinary standards are incredible, like going in voluntarily with the first wave of troops on D-Day. But Capa survived. He knew how to survive. He joked that perhaps he had a guardian angel on his shoulder. He had no death wish. But had it been necessary to make photographs that would have swung public opinion in the direction he hoped, I think he would have been willing.
Bob Capa was parachuted into Germany with the airborne troops. He was the second man to jump out of the airplane which dropped the soldiers over the main line of German defense. He stayed with the Allied troops while they fought their way to Berlin. He later joined in with the celebrations in Paris, writing, "That was a most unforgettable day. I returned to Paris, the magnificent city where I learned to drink, eat, and love." There are these happy scenes, but there are also pictures of humiliation, of the last altercations, and the settling of scores. The Englishman George Roger became a war correspondent for Life magazine thanks to his photos of the Blitz in London. He also covered the deportation camps. When he saw the scale of the horrors there, he almost gave up the job. Margaret Bourke-White was the only female photographer that the American forces accepted. Her photographs of concentration camps, prisoners dying of hunger, and the victims of the gas chambers shocked the world. These living dead who survived Buchenwald gazed in stupefaction at the Americans who came to liberate them in April 1945. As the Allies advanced and liberated the camps, Eisenhower asked the newspapers to send reporters to record the events for posterity. 6,000 dignitaries of the Reich in Berlin committed suicide. Germany was in ruins, and the Red Army marched through the Brandenburg Gate. Evgeny Kaldai, who was perfectly placed to photograph the arrival of the Russian troops in Berlin, aimed to portray it as a symbolic victory.
I saw Rosenthal's photo. When it was taken, I was still in Budapest. It looked like victory had occurred in the Pacific. I wanted to take similar photos in Berlin, and I did.
Kaldai's famous photo was retouched. The second watch on the soldier's wrist was erased. There was no need to show the Soviets as pillagers. Kaldai had difficulty framing his picture because he wanted the flag to be flying and the burning capital to be visible too.
Hitler could never have dreamed that the Russian flag, made by a little Jewish tailor from Moscow, would one day fly from the Reichstag building and be immortalized in a photo which was taken by another Jew.
For symbolic reasons, Stalin wanted to be the first to take Berlin. So that the photograph coincided with the chronology, he had it backdated. Half a century later, Kaldai and Rosenthal met for the first time.
I never dreamed that I would meet him. It's that you were born in Russia and I was born in America. I want to tell you how proud I am now to get to meet you.
Fierce fighting flares again in Indochina as the French rush reinforcements into the Mekong area to stem a Red advance that vastly outnumbered.
In May 1954, the rice fields of Tonking were awash with blood. Life magazine asked Kappa, who was in Japan at the time, to go to Hanoi and cover the war. Kappa was by then a veteran of 20 campaigns and had survived the most violent fighting in the Spanish Civil War and the Second World War. But on May 22, 1954, his luck ran out. A few seconds after taking this photo, he was blown up by a landmine on the road between Namdin and Tai Binh. Daniel Camus was a sergeant in the paratroopers by the age of 25 and witnessed the Battle of Dien Bien Phu.
When Dien Bien Phu started, it was top secret, of course. We were let in on the secret, and we were parachuted in. A photographer and a filmmaker were chosen to jump with the first wave. We were unarmed, and we had to run for it because we came across some Viet Minh. So we frantically raced across the rice fields, and believe me, when it hasn't been cut, rice is hard to get through. The beginning of March saw the start of 57 days of battle, during which shells fell every minute. We were constantly being bombarded. We covered the events as well as we could, and we had our photos sent out along with the wounded.
France wearied of all the bloodshed in Dien Bien Phu. It signed the peace agreement on May 8, 1954, and retreated from Indochina. Vietnam brandished the victory flag. In June 1950, when war in Korea broke out, David Douglas Duncan was in Japan writing an article on Japanese art. The former war photographer who had been with the Marines in the Pacific reached the front 3 days later. In sub-zero temperatures and despite being ambushed by the Chinese, Duncan followed the Marines on foot for 130 kilometers as they retreated from the dam of Tianjin to the American lines by the Sea of Japan. In October 1956, Budapest rose up against the Soviets. Jean-Pierre Pedrazini had been sent to Hungary to cover his first war. He saved the life of a young boy before being shot at by a tank. He saw his last ever report from his hospital bed. The 60s were a carefree time. War was a taboo subject. However, despite the censorship, certain photographers tried to alert the public as to what was going on close to home. Claude Azoulay, for example, was sent to Bizerte to cover a brief but violent war. Then there was Algeria, a long conflict that photographers had trouble covering because no one ever knew where the next confrontation would be. Azoulay, who grew up in North Africa in a country at war, lived through 20 conflicts over a period of 40 years.
There are secret wars, wars that don't get photographed much. The war in Algeria remained fairly hidden. It didn't get much coverage because we were reluctant to be a part of this war. The war in Indochina was similar in a way, but the photographs taken during the Vietnam War brought the American people closer to war.
Photography evolved with the Vietnam War. The explosion of press photography shocked readers by revealing the violence of the war. This war, which was supposed to be brief, dragged on hopelessly. The American Larry Burroughs, a correspondent for Life magazine, covered Vietnam for 9 years. His photos are crude and cruel. Burroughs wanted to persuade people in the West that there was a great human tragedy going on. The photographs had a clear political agenda. The color pictures accentuated the reality to the detriment of the artistic side. Life said that only his pictures conveyed the color of blood.
This is Sabre 6, over. Roger, Sabre 6, we've observed a column of vehicles that are stopped 2 miles.
He covered the whole war alongside the soldiers and died in a helicopter operation like this one.
Find out if this is an Arvin roadblock or Vietcong, over.
The Englishman Don McCullen devoted almost 25 years of his life to war reporting and took an impressive series of photos of the Tet Offensive in 1968. His pictures portray the awful conditions in which civilians suffered or died and helped to sway public opinion.
Photography during the Vietnam War played an official role in maintaining the war effort, but ultimately, I think it served to demonstrate the atrocity of war. In fact, out of all the images of war, the photo that stands out for me is Marc Ribou's photo showing a woman with a rose facing up to the soldiers with their bayonets at Kent State University. I think that photo helped to end the war. I think it's a decisive, historic photo. There haven't been many like that in the history of war.
It's become an absolute necessity for photographers to cover wars. In Lebanon, it's no longer a question of choosing sides or defending a cause. Photographers portray the tragic destiny of Beirut, a city in ruins. Ireland has its terrible civil war, a religious war which uses real bullets as well as rubber bullets, water cannons, and tear gas.
We can't get engaged personally because it's too difficult to photograph. If we were to become personally engaged in the conflict, we would never get our work done. It's with newspapers, we have deadlines to meet. We've got to process our films there. We've got to wire them, so we have all these problems. And to be engaged with one side or the other, it just wouldn't work. For that reason, it can become difficult because loyalists would know that I am from the South and I'm a nationalist. However, we have to do our job.
The complexity of local or religious conflicts means that photographers cannot defend their ideals. They're interested in the victims. That's the only cause worth standing up for.
as a photographer if you attempt to take images to protect all the innocent people, and there are guilty people on all sides. So it makes it easier that way to feel for everybody. My interest is in life and the human condition, and unfortunately, I mean, the last since I started since '89, the world condition has really deteriorated, and that's what I've chosen to push my efforts into.
I think that the violent, brutal faces seen in wars will certainly go down as some of the great moments of photography. Some photographers produce their best work in times of war. This was clearly true of Robert Capa during the Spanish Civil War. War and photography form a tragically steadfast pair.
War reporters are a credit to the photographic profession. Some died on the front line covering the news. Some suffered physical injury. But the living too left their youth, their illusions, and a little of their soul on the battlefields. An army of ghosts are here by our side.